Hello and welcome to this video looking at the GCSE AQA psychology course and the perception topic. These videos are going to be looking at the final part of the topic, which are factors affecting perception. So we'll have a look at the spec and then we'll have a look at how the studies that we're going to look at fit into that. So what does the spec say you need to know? Well, this is, as I said, factors affecting perception. You'll usually look at this after you've looked at some of the rest of the content. So you probably started looking at sensation and perception, visual illusions, visual cues, and probably have already looked at two theories of Hudson's theory and Gregory's constructivist theory. So this final part of the specification is looking at well, what other things are impacting our ability to perceive the world around us. So as you can see there, what you'll need to know is what a perceptual set is and the effects of things such as culture, motivation, emotion, and expectation. Now, the way to look at this is pretty much a study for each of those things. It helps you to understand what research has taken part and what some of the conclusions are, and maybe some contradictory research or supporting research in some of the cases. And then finally there, that second bullet point is looking at the two studies. So if you've looked at any of the other topics in the GCSE AQA course, you'll know that there are named studies on the specification, and that for those named studies, what you need to be able to do is talk about the aim, the method, the results, conclusions, and be able to evaluate those studies. And so for the perception are the Gilchrist and Nesberg study, looking at motivation, and then the Brunner and Minturn study looking at perceptual set, but in particular expectation. So those are the studies you know. Of course, you still need to know about Gibson and Gregory. Those are theories. You still need to know what those are and evaluate them. But these are the two studies that are mentioned on the spec. But what we'll do is, as I say, we'll look at a study for each of those factors of culture, motivation, emotion, and expectation. So we'll look at 4 studies, but it's good for you to know that actually the only 2 that you can be asked direct questions on are the Gilchrist and Nesberg study of motivation and the Brunner and Minturn study of perceptual set expectation. So let's get into it. First then, let's look at factors affecting perception and in particular culture. Okay, so what do we need to know about culture and the impact of culture on perception? Well, as I said, we will look at a different study for each of those things. And so we will look into the Hudsons study to start to have an understanding on how culture can affect our perception. First of all, though, you'll need to know what a perceptual set is. That's mentioned in the specification. So the perceptual set is our ability, our want, our desire for something to impact our perception. So often it's our drives. So think of a hunger drive. We'll look at that later on. Think of a drive to breathe or drink. So all of those things, just think of things that could potentially affect how you're taking in the world. Is what you're seeing accurate? Is what you're hearing accurate? Is what you're tasting accurate? And so it's things around us that can affect our perception. So yeah, is the brain seeing what it wants to see, or is it actually things that are happening? So it's, yeah, another way of explaining the perceptual set is our readiness to take things in from the world. And are we taking that in accurately because our readiness is there? So we're, you know, our emotion isn't having the better of us, our drives and our motivation, we're not absolutely starving hungry, so that's affecting things. If we're in a content state, then our perceptual set will take in the world maybe more accurately. But if there are other things going on, as I say, our culture is impacting us, our emotion, our motivation, then perhaps the perceptual set is being affected by other things. And so, yeah, essentially the perceptual set is the other factors that can affect our perception. So looking at that in terms of the culture then, so culture could be part of our perceptual set. So the culture that you're growing up in, can that have an effect on the way you take in the world? The first thing I would say is that you need to have a bit of an understanding of what is a culture before we go into looking at, well, how does culture affect our perception. So culture is anything really that's had an impact on your environment as you've been growing up. It could be your parents' beliefs, your religion, your race, your educational background, your I don't know, beliefs, your food preferences, whether you're a vegetarian or not, that might be part of your culture. So it's kind of outside influences, it's things that shape your view of the world. So already you can see that there might then be an effect of that on our perception. So how was this tested then? It's been tested in several different ways, but the study that we'll look at is Hudson. So Hudson, 1960, conducted a study. So this was 60 years ago already. So we can already start thinking about some of the evaluations, and there are some issues around that. And as well, when I start describing what the study was and how they investigated it, you might have some questions around that and whether that is the most accurate, the most ethical way to do things. But actually, we just need to take the study at face value at the moment for what it does or doesn't tell us about culture. And then actually it comes out in the evaluation. It will be unsurprising when we go through this to know that there are a few weaknesses to see whether this is a strong study or not. So what did Hudson aim to do? So obviously, as I said, you need to have an awareness of whether culture affects our perception, and that's what the study was looking at. So Hudson aimed to investigate if people from different cultures had differences in their perception of depth cues. So hopefully you've already looked at depth cues, looking at the perceptual topic. These are the things that tell us whether we're meant to think something's far away or closer to us. It can be things like relative size or height in plane, those sorts of things. And so Hudson wanted to see whether culture had an impact on that. Hudson's research took part in South Africa. And so looking at culture in South Africa in the 60s, obviously quite different to other countries and quite different to South Africa today. But the two things there that would have had a big impact on culture, one is education. So those that were educated obviously had some idea of perception and some introduction to these 2D models, and those that weren't educated didn't have that. And there was also apartheid, so your race would have had an impact. So whether you're a white South African or a black South African in the 60s, you would have had quite a different experience there. And so Hudson wanted to see what impact that might have had. So Hudson ended up with 4 groups. This is what's known as an independent measure design. You are either in one group or another. You can't be both educated and uneducated. You can't be both black and white. Michael Jackson that, but in South Africa at the time, certainly you couldn't. So he was looking at whether the cultural background had an impact on these outcomes, and so showed these 4 different groups. So you were either white educated, white uneducated, black educated, or black uneducated, and he showed them 2D pictures of a perceptual set. The pictures are there with the similar to the ones on the screen, with the hunter and an elephant and a gazelle, and wanted to see whether by looking at these pictures, these different groups could understand the depth cues, so could understand where the hunter was looking at. So showed the 4 different groups these pictures and asked them some different questions. So some of the questions are, what do you see? What is the man doing? And which is nearer, the man, the elephant, or the antelope? Now, if you've already studied some of the perception topic and you've looked at depth cues, you would hopefully say, certainly for that top picture, that the hunter was going for the antelope. And the reason for that is the relative size. So the elephant is tiny. We're not thinking that's a miniature elephant. We're thinking that's an actual proper elephant. It's just further away. So the relative size is smaller, which tells us it's further away. Also, its height in plane is higher. So it's further up in the image, and that suggests it's further away, whereas the antelope is further down. That suggests it's closer. There's maybe a bit of linear perspective there, probably not a bit of occlusion in the top image anyway. In the bottom image there is some occlusion with the spear and the elephant. So the answer should be that in the top image, the hunter is going for the antelope because of the depth cues. So the results from Hudson's study show that while both educated groups were more likely to perceive the depth cues. So if you had been educated compared to those that had been uneducated, they were more likely to say that answer, say that the man was hunting the antelope. There also seemed to be an impact on race. So the white participants were more likely to perceive the depth cues than the black participants. And again, it's culture and what was happening in South Africa at the time would suggest that those racial differences. And so what could Hudson conclude from this? Hudson concluded that culture did indeed have an impact on our ability to perceive depth cues. So the environment that you've been in will have an impact on that. If you think about that, and you've already looked at Gregory's constructivist theory of perception, you'll see that this supports that. So Gregory said that actually our perception comes from our environment and we learn to perceive, and so this Hudson study would support that view. It suggests that those that have been educated were better able to perceive depth cues than those that are uneducated, and it would suggest that there were those racial differences as well. So there's something about the white and the black communities that had an impact on their ability to perceive depth cues. And again, the conclusions would suggest that this is an impact of education and an impact of apartheid, and yeah, different exposure to 2D images. So that was what Hudson would suggest. Culture does indeed have an impact on depth cues. Is this accurate or not? Well, that's where, so this would be your AO1. You need to know the aim, the method, the results, conclusion. What did they aim to do? What did they do? What did they find? What does that mean? We then need to evaluate the study and say whether the study was accurate or not. And there are some issues with this, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so the first weakness of this study is the fact that it's what's known as cross-cultural research. So Hudson, probably more Western in his views, and probably educated as well, and he is now trying to conduct research on different races and different levels of education. And that could mean that actually there's some misunderstandings. So the point here, the first weakness point is that, yeah, there could be misunderstanding in cross-cultural research. Elaborating on that, explaining that, well, what was probably happening here, there were translators used, and in cross-cultural research, if you use translators, there can sometimes be misunderstandings. So it could just be that the translator isn't very good and doesn't understand what the researchers asked for and uses a close enough word, but actually it's not close at all. It could be that there's no direct translation between one language and another. And so the instructions change. And what that means is what's being requested might be unclear, it might be misunderstood, or simply have a completely different meaning when translated. So trying to then compare one culture to another when actually the instructions are quite different, and you then end up getting different results in these different cultures, which is what we found in this study. You know, Hudson's interpreted that as cultures having a difference in perception, whereas actually it could just be down to the differences in what they've been asked to do and how they've been asked to do it. So your IV, your independent variable, your culture isn't actually impacting your DV, your dependent variable perception and accuracy on some of those answers. And so therefore, what that should mean, our conclusion, if we're using PEC, is that cross-cultural studies such as Hudson's might actually lack validity. So validity, are they being accurate? Are they studying what they intend to study? Well, actually, if the questions haven't been asked in the way they should have been asked, then no, you're not studying what you intend to study, and so you would question the validity of the outcomes for that reason when it comes to cross-cultural studies. A second evaluative point and another weakness is that actually there may have been methodological issues. What I mean by methodological issues, method, the way that the study took place, what happened in the study. Well, here what you find is that participants were presented with pictures on paper and asked to look at depth cues. Well, what was found was that for some of the participants, certainly the uneducated ones, this could have been the first time that they've seen 2D images. For some, it was said that it was the first time they'd seen paper. And so to say that their results being poor, and they may well have been poor, but the results may have been poor because they were so confused or intrigued by what they were being asked to do and the material that was being put in front of them, of course they're not going to understand the depth cues. It's such a foreign concept. It's something they've never experienced in their lives before. So actually it doesn't necessarily mean that they can't do the perception. They could well do if they were used to the stimulus, and if, like the last evaluative point, if the questions had been asked in the right way, maybe the results may have been different. And so it may be that the results are inaccurate then. The methods and the culture might not have, sorry, the culture might not have been impacting the perception. It could have been the methods. And what that therefore means is that the results from these cross-cultural studies, like Hudson's, like I've said before, again may lack validity. They may not be showing what the researchers are claiming that they're actually showing. And finally, another evaluative point, another weakness, is that actually, again, the design and the process might not be as stringent as what we might see today. So the Hudson study took place in 1960, that was 60 years ago. You would like to hope that studies conducted, more modern studies, might have more stringent controls. They might make sure that none of the questions were leaked or different, the game wasn't given away, and that the way that the results were recorded. Obviously, there's a lot more technology involved these days. Maybe there's more accurate ways of recording it. Don't actually know how it was recorded in Hudson study, but you would like to think basically that a more modern study could go through more stringent checks and be more scientifically valid because of that. And so therefore the poor control from past cross-cultural studies such as Hudson's again may lack validity. It may not be showing what we think it's showing. Again, because of the methods, because of the way that maybe the researchers acted, maybe the way that the data was or wasn't collected. There could be other ways of the participants showing that they did know it well, when actually the way that it was recorded showed they didn't, and that could be a weakness of the study, and suggests that we need to be wary when looking at the results from studies like this and just completely concluding, yes, culture has an effect. The people from the uneducated and the black cultures were poorer than the white. Well, actually that might not have been the case due to the methods that have taken place. So that hopefully gives you some insight into the effect of culture on perception. That was the main Hudson study and some evaluation there. There have been some other studies that have actually backed this up, so that's maybe a strength for Hudson study. So the Derogowski study, where they looked at elephants overhead images and whether they saw that as a bird's eye view or they perceived that as kind of what they call the split view. That supports the idea there were cultural differences found there as well. There have also been case studies done. Colin Turnbull did a case study where took people from the Congo of Africa to see planes, and they couldn't believe that the buffalo that they saw in the distance, they thought they were ants, and that when they got closer to them and they got bigger, they thought that was witchcraft, when actually it was just an impact of perception. So there are some supporting studies, and it does appear that culture does have some sort of an impact on perception, but you need to be critical of studies, particularly Hudson's, and the limitations that are around for that. I hope that was helpful. I'll make another video and we will then look at the impact of emotion on